Okay, everybody, I have written another short story, and I'm gonna read it to you guys. I don't have any professional microphones. I don't have any professional equipment. Everything I do is with an iPhone 11 and a Gen 2 iPad Pro. And that's it. That's all I have to work with. So I apologize for the audio quality. I'm doing my best to create stories for you guys. That's about all the original content other than doggies and kitties and stuff that I can come up with. So I'm going to write the occasional story and read them to you. This one is sci-fi, so I hope you guys like it better than the horror story I wrote last time. We'll see. Stick around to the end, hopefully.
The Mall. Eddie tripped and fell, scraping his knee on the red sandstone floor. He got back up and ran as hard as he could. Panic was giving him wings as he pushed past people that stood in the underground corridor, gawking at the smoke coming from the apartment block he was racing towards. No matter how hard he ran, it seemed as if the fire was getting further and further away. The air scrubbers were shrieking as they spun up into emergency mode. The smoke parted as if Moses had ordered it to stand aside for Eddie. Finally, he made it to the front door of the apartment block. The red light flashing above indicated there had been an atmospheric breach. The decompression locks on the door were trapping everybody inside. There was a huge booming noise as the whole residential cell shook. Lights flickered. Eddie didn't care about the dangers. He pounded on the door, yelling for the fire crews to hurry up. They were the only ones that had the key to disengage the decompression locks. There was a small window in the door where he could see the smoke inside. The smoke was black and filling up the ground floor. The entire apartment block must be ablaze. And in his panic, he almost didn't see the small figure running out of the smoke. But when he did, his heart stopped. Eddie's son ran out of the fire and started pounding on the door. Eddie screamed and shouted for the firemen. "Open the door! For God's sake, someone open the door!" Eddie screamed. Huey was pounding his small fists against the door. He was only a foot away. The reinforced door didn't let his little voice through, but Eddie could feel his son's fears and tears. The small window only gave a glimpse of Huey's blonde mop. He was too short to see that his own father was only inches away. Eddie was beyond panicked, beyond frenzied. His son was right there. Why couldn't someone open the damn door? It was then the whole block collapsed. In what felt like slow motion, he saw Huey look up and into his eyes at the last second. Tears ran down his face, making clean streaks in the soot that clung to his skin. Then, in a blink, Huey was crushed under a landslide of falling debris. Eddie sat bolt upright in bed. He was covered in cold sweat and his hands were sore from clenching his sheets. He was panting and his voice was sore. He'd been screaming in his sleep. The tiny living cell carved out of cold stone was soundproof as a matter of nature rather than design. He could have had a marching band parade through his living room and no one would notice. Eddie sobbed softly into his sheets. The cold gray walls around him were only dimly illuminated by the open window beside his bed. Eddie took deep breaths until the world regained its focus. He slipped his legs out of bed and onto the carpeted stone floor. The dark red rug was made of the cheapest artificial burgundy fibers, but it was warmer than the granite floor. He stood up and walked a short distance to the light switch and turned the knob to the first setting to gently illuminate his stark little cell. He was no prisoner, at least not in the literal sense. Everyone who lived on or near the mall lived in similar conditions. It was a far cry from the tall vaulted ceilings and warm corridors of Mars. Things on this planet were designed for utility, not to inspire. He walked across the bedroom to the bathroom and ran some water over his head. He was still shaking. PTSD is a bitch, and he knew all too well that he would be reliving his son's death until the day he joined him. At least that's what the counselor told him over and over. He looked at himself in the mirror. His rough features and his shocking silver hair stood in wild contrast to his bright blue eyes. He was only 29 years old when he arrived on Exo 77, but hypersleep sometimes had strange side effects. You don't age in hypersleep. At least that's what they tell you. One guy he knew had woken up from the simulated state of death with grotesquely long fingernails on one hand. For Eddie, it had been his hair. When he woke up for the first time from the long sleep and saw himself in the mirror, he didn't recognize the man in front of him. Even now, 8 years later, he still had trouble with mirrors. His counselor said it was a side effect of hypersleep. Skipping 3 years of your life in a machine while traveling across the stars could cause disassociation. They called it the stranger syndrome. Well, at least that's what people on the hypernet called it. The company FL Medical denied there were any psychological side effects to hypersleep. They did, however, give him the standard compensation for anybody with permanent changes in appearance. He didn't see why going gray early constituted compensation, but he took the money anyway. He walked out of the bathroom and back into the main room. This room was all-purpose. It was his bedroom, his kitchen, and his living space. There were 2 uncomfortable chairs in front of the video wall, but he usually sat in bed to watch the news. Eddie looked at the large window beside his bed. It was frosted over in privacy mode. The window was rectangular and stretched from the head of his bed to the edge of the kitchenette. Its corners were rounded and it reached to the ceiling. This was the only item in his apartment cell that reminded him of Mars. When you live underground, big windows are your secret to sanity. Just like on Mars, most of the living spaces were carved into the bare rock. But unlike Mars, this planet had a breathable atmosphere. There was also no need for a gravity web. This planet, although slightly larger than Earth, generated a livable 1.1 G. Exo 77 was one of many off-world colonies. No one called it that, however. Eddie tapped the switch by the window to disengage the privacy mode. The frosted glass became clear, and the blue-gray morning greeted him. It was raining. It was literally always raining. In the distance, lightning flashed for a moment, and he could see through the fog. The gaping cavern, called simply the Maw, was briefly illuminated. It was no wonder people had colloquially named this colony after the great cavernous void. It was the largest cave ever discovered in the known universe. The mouth of it was a gaping 7 kilometers tall and 8 kilometers wide. It was so big that it had its own microclimate and weather. If one squinted, one could see the tiny little lights all over it. Many workers in the mines lived in places carved into this impossible mouth. It still gave him chills, even after living here for 8 years. He intentionally rented quarters as far away from the Maw as he could. It was impossible to get a place without a view of the Maw. It was positioned in a massive valley on the eastern face of a rocky bowl. This depression valley kept the hurricane-force winds at bay that swept across the lifeless planet. It was only in and around the Maw that life could cling. It was too cold and the winds were too powerful to live anywhere else. The mountaintops surrounding the depression containing the Maw would make Everest look like a sandcastle. Their summits towered so high that there was no atmosphere at all on their peaks. Hard vacuum was all that awaited anyone mad enough to try and climb the peaks above the Maw. The depression was big enough to contain the entire colony, including the massive spaceport used to send the many minerals mined from the Maw itself. Lithium, cobalt, and uranium were some of the many treasures that kept this boomtown colony up and running. The fog was starting to lift. The many lights twinkling in the void were multiplying and beginning to move around. It was too cold to run around the outside at night. It was a 43-hour day-night cycle on this planet, but everybody still used standard Earth calendar. There were geothermal vents inside the Maw itself, allowing mining to continue day or night. Everybody else had to adhere to strict timetables to know when it was safe to go outside. Even at the equivalent of high noon, the air was only a few degrees above freezing. So why in the world would anybody choose to live in this hellscape? For most people, the answer was money. One could make a good living in hell. Whether you were a miner or a business owner, there was good money to be had from the riches within the Maw. Eddie, of course, came here to forget. After he lost his son on Mars, he had tried living on Earth. It was too alien, even though he didn't have to acclimate to the higher gravity. Ubiquitous gravity well technology made it so that no matter where you lived, you could expect a steady 1G. Of course, that only applied to those willing to live in underground corridors or in hard vacuum, clinging to machines, spinning in the emptiness of space. Earth had too much sun, too much sky, and too much cheeriness for him. It was alien for a Martian to stare up into an endless blue horizon. It felt like he was cheating. It felt like he was turning his back on his son. Huey had always talked about going to Earth someday. Eddie was born on Mars, like his son. He had, of course, fantasized about life on the ancestral home of man when he was a child, too. Huey was different, though. He filled his days with learning everything he could about Earth. From history to geology, his son was obsessed with all things Earth. When Eddie traveled to Earth to try and start a new life, he found it to be tacky and insincere. He knew these feelings were just his grief acting out, but it didn't matter. The sunny days and the sun on his face felt false. Maybe if he had his son at his side, he could have lived on Earth. A month into a nice lease in Chicago, he had got up one day and signed up for a job that would take him so far from Earth that it would take years in hypersleep to get there. Even at faster than light speeds, most space travel included hypersleep. And that's why he lived in the Maw, a place so alien that almost nothing reminded him of home. His hand terminal buzzed and chirped in the morning gloom. He ran his hands through his white hair and picked it up. A picture of an older man grinning with a flashing number illuminated the screen. He picked up the call. "Hey, Eddie, good buddy. Hope I didn't wake you on your day off," said the endlessly optimistic face of his partner Sadiq. To say that he was of mixed race was to do disservice to the mixing pot that was the human race. His grinning tan face and abundant smiling wrinkles gave no clue as to his ancestral origins. Other than he had dark hair and light almond eyes, his temples were going gray, and his well-shaven jaw looked thick enough to crack walnuts. "Hello, Eddie," Sadiq called Eddie from his dark dreams in that unmistakable, ambiguous accent. It said to the listener, "I'm exotic, but I don't know what kind of exotic." "Sorry, Sonny, I was just having bad dreams again. Didn't sleep real good." Everybody called him Sonny. He had a way to stay cheerful even on this desolate planet, and people loved him for it. Eddie, I keep telling you that you need a good woman in your bed, my friend. Someone to give you good dreams," he said, beaming through the video call. Eddie smiled despite himself. "Sure, Sonny, as soon as you get one yourself, too." "Oh, you know I'm much too ugly to get married." It was a cheerful lie. The women he knew were always asking how Sonny was doing in subtly veiled attempts to get closer to the man. The truth was he didn't settle down because he had too many choices on his plate. Eddie chuckled and shook his head. "So why are you calling me on my day off?" "Well, I don't want to ruin your day, but something has happened in the mines. Might be murder, might not. The boss wants us to check it out." "Which mine?" asked Eddie. "Lithium 11, replied Sonny. "Oh, hell," Eddie said, pinching the bridge of his nose. Yes, the cursed one. Even I have trouble with that one. It even gives me the willies." Okay, Eddie said. "Meet you at the tram station?" "See you there," Sonny said, ending the call. Eddie looked back out the window. The fog had lifted, and even through the dreary day, he could see the vast black maw crying out over the mountain, like a massive mouth threatening to devour everything in the valley. He headed back into the bathroom to take a quick shower. Eddie waved his ham terminal over the register to pay for his bagel. The tall, lanky kid nodded at him, and he turned around. Balancing his coffee and bagel with his terminal, he jumped quickly through the closing doors of the tram. He looked around and found an empty seat facing the window. The thick layers of his clothing made it awkward to sit without sliding on the unfurnished plastic seat. If it looked like he was heading for a polar expedition, it was because the Maw's weather was as temperamental as everything on this damn planet. The geothermal effect was minimal when at the widest parts of the Maw. Just like the whole Depression Valley, the temperatures could vary wildly from barely above freezing to way below zero in minutes. Wearing more layers than you needed was the norm. The tram lurched forward. At first, there was nothing but dull gray rock out the window. When the tram exited the tunnel, you could hear the change before you saw it. The roar of rain pounding down on the roof started at the front of the train and traveled down the cars until the tram was exposed to the dark, wet day. The people around him turned the volume up on their private devices to drown out the rain. Eddie wasn't one to bury his nose in distractions while commuting. He was always aware. He had been a cop on Mars, a cop on Earth, and now a cop in the Maw. He sipped his coffee and stared across the valley while chewing on his soy cheese bagel. It was still moving through rock, but to the south one could look out across the valley and just barely make out the other side. Of course, if you pressed your face against the window, you could see the Maw approaching quickly to the east. After around 15 minutes, the tram slowed and stopped at the station near the Maw itself. The doors opened and he stepped out, chucking his trash in the bin by a rocky pillar. Sonny's large frame and wide shoulders marked him out at least a head taller than the surrounding commuters. He was scrolling through the news on his hand terminal, just wasting time, waiting for his partner. Eddie raised his hand to get his attention. Sonny cheerfully picked up his way through the commuters and met up with Eddie. "They say there's a big storm coming in a few hours, so we need to get a move on, my friend," Sonny said as they strode into the elevator together. "Tell me what you know so far," Eddie said, tapping the call button on the lift. The body was found deep, very deep, down the Lithium-11 mine complex. They would have never found it if it hadn't been for a prospector looking for new veins to try. The victim was a Sumar Khan, aged 49, Sonny said as the dull metallic walls of the elevator vibrated harmlessly. "What guild is he from?" Eddie asked. "Free workers," Sonny replied. "Shit, a lifer?" "Indeed, my friend. He's been mining the Maw since before the colony ratification. Started digging when he was 11. The elevator slowed to a halt. The doors opened up to a cacophony of colors, smell, and sound. The curved ceiling of the bazaar made all the sound echo and reverberate as many screams above the shop's plate advertisements. The smell of a wide variety of spices and dishes combined with the stink of a dense crowd of people was unique to this little stretch of the underground. Everywhere there were merchants and buyers going about their day, oblivious to the tragedy. Sonny and Eddie knew better than to try and yell over the noise of the bazaar. They cut through the crowds quickly to the little door that had a simple sign above it that said in both Mandarin and English, "XO 77, Union Police." Ducking in, the plastisteel door made a slight hiss as it sealed behind them. They passed quickly from the side door, ignoring the rest of the station, to appear outside in the open-air parking lot in front of the station. The cold, strong winds blasted them as soon as they walked outside. They both zipped up their outerwear and slipped on synthetic fur-lined hoods. Hands were shoved into pockets as they jogged towards the cruiser. The maglift vehicle was the best way to get around. The terrain of the Maw was resistant to standard paving. The constant swings in temperature were always wreaking havoc on anything from asphalt to stone. All roadways were made by simply flattening and buffing raw rock. In standard black and white, it looked like any other car of its time. They both piled in with Sonny driving. "So, do we have a cause of death?" Eddie continued the conversation now that the wind and the crowds were abated from the soundscape. "Mining laser, straight through the heart," Sonny said. "Full-size laser?" "The coroner thinks so, but the hollow imaging wasn't done when the captain handed down the case. From the size of the hole, it probably wasn't one of the handheld units." "Well, that makes it murder then," Eddie said, rubbing the gray stubble on his chin. They were approaching the Maw proper now. He could see light pouring out of the various cuts into the rock that allowed traffic through into the Maw. They were cut at half-a-kilometer intervals across the entire working face of the cavern. Caves, no matter the size, weren't flat and accessible at their lowest point. The first 10 kilometers of the Maw's cavern had been leveled to allow for industrialization and traffic. Each massive cut allowed for anything to pass through, even giant mining vehicles. They took the first opening and passed into the Maw itself. Up along the surface of the Maw, almost straight to the top, were dwellings and businesses pushing deep into the Maw's interior. Their windows, balconies, and railed footpaths almost made you forget that this was a massive, natural, geologic formation. It made the artifice appear man-made when it was merely humans using what was already there to carve out a slice of life. The chaotic swirl of unregulated traffic lanes took them deeper into the Maw. The further back they went, the dimmer the light became. There were, of course, massive tall streetlights and various windows still, but the top of the cavern was cloaked in impenetrable darkness. Eventually, all but the streetlights began to vanish. Most of the windows were dark and unoccupied, and the frequency of their appearance grew less and less. They were approaching mining territory. Greenish-yellow movable bollard lights looked like bioluminescent mushrooms, subtly controlling the flow of equipment in this industrial area. Sonny steered the car towards one of the flashing lanes as the ground grew more uneven. The maglift kept the ride smooth, but floating up and down always made Eddie a little queasy. Eventually they came to a huge arch where the wall of the maw had been cut away. The floodlights showed all the workers standing around smoking Juma sticks and generally killing time while the site was shut down for investigation. They were getting paid either way, so a shutdown wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Most deaths in a mine were for the normal reasons, but every so often tempers flare and bodies drop for unnatural reasons. They parked the car near the big office cube made of reinforced plastisteel. It housed the offices and departments of individuals necessary to run the lithium mine. As they got out of the car, they saw the local foreman, Thomas, moving towards them with a couple of hard hats under his arm. His short, muscled build spoke of a lifetime of intense physical labor, and so did his gait. He walked like he was carrying a boulder on his back, even when unburdened. He handed the two police officers hard hats and held out his hand. They shook it curtly. "It's a hell of a thing," Thomas said. "Thanks for getting here so fast. The rumor mill is working overtime out there," he said, gesturing to the group of miners covered in dust and debris from the mine. "What do the workers think happened?" Sonny asked. "Most of them think it's simple murder. Murder, suicide, that kind of thing." "Most of them?" Eddie said in a leading way. "Yeah, some have been talking about singing. The idea is starting up again that there's some kind of damned siren down there calling men to their death. As if the mines aren't dangerous enough as is." "Who found the body?" Sonny asked. The foreman gestured to the office building, and they walked in the translucent front door. Two men sat in chairs in stark contrast to the clean gray walls of the prefab building. Their faces were black with soot, but their eyes shone through the layers of mining filth. They were both filled with worry and dread. Years as a cop taught you how to read people, and these people were terrified. The foreman wasted no time. "Mitch, Momo, I'm sure you have something to tell the officers." They stood up, and when they did, Sonny cracked a smile. "I remember you two," he said, chuckling. After a second, they both smiled nervously, recognition lighting up in their eyes, helping cut through the fear. Sonny was a natural people person. Eddie found it easier to let others do the talking while listening. The worker named Mitch opened his arms and embraced Sonny. Sonny chuckled and patted him on the back. "Eddie, let me introduce you to these two lifers. While you were busy working cases up valley, I was throwing these two in the drunk tank every other weekend, it seemed. They really know how to party." Eddie smiled and shook their hands. Mitch spoke up first. "What do you want to know? We got nothing to hide." Sonny replied, Just take it from the top." Eddie looked at Momo, who simply nodded. "Sorry, Momo here doesn't talk, but he has an implant that lets him hear," said Mitch, wrinkles around his eyes exposing the flashes of skin underneath. "Vac ear?" Eddie asked. "That's right. Nothing in those ear holes but tech now," Mitch said. Vac air was caused by violent decompression. There were pockets of vacuum all throughout the maw. Crack into one with significant enough negative pressure, and losing your hearing was the least of your worries. The implant was beyond a normal hearing aid. People with vac ear have nothing left of their hearing organs, so a device is installed that directly transmits sound to the part of the brain which controls hearing. There was a bit of delay, but otherwise it allowed someone with massive hearing damage to get by. Momo's eyes were still wide and darted around nervously. "It was Momo here who found the poor bastard," Mitch said. After a moment's delay, Momo glanced at Mitch and nodded. Momo waved his hand in deliberate patterns. Mitch translated the sign language and told the tale for both of them. "We were checking out the old subshafts, looking for new veins. We weren't split up. You always need a buddy down there. He was just out of my sight for a second when I heard him yelp. There was nothing wrong with his voice, so he sometimes makes little noises on accident. This time he sounded pretty freaked out. I came around the corner, and there was a man laying beside a K-30 laser drill. The big kind you need to mount on something. That mine shaft was barely wide enough for Momo, let alone something big enough to transport the drill. Momo had tripped over the fellow in the darkness. That part of the mine has no working lighting, but we could tell the man was dead." Momo interjected in sign language, and Mitch said, Right, Mo." Momo said that he could tell the fellow wasn't in the right mind at all. He was a miner, no doubt, but Momo says his boots said he worked for United Cobalt. That's all the way on the other side of the mall. So we just hit the E button on our belts. We've seen plenty of bodies over the years. Find a body, hit the button. It's the company policy. Eddie asked, how often do you guys find bodies? Me and Mo? More so this year. About double for the whole mine together. Usually it's just bad luck, but a man with a hole in his chest is more than that. Someone did this on purpose. At least that's what me and Mo figure. Momo made a sign of the cross and shook his head. Eddie reached out and placed his hand on Momo's shoulder. Momo looked up and nodded to Eddie. Some gestures are beyond speech. And that's it. We hit the button and waited for the boss man for about 30 minutes or so. When he confirmed that there was indeed actually a body and not some mud stuffer trying to get some time off, he called upstairs and they shut down the whole damn mine, Mitch concluded. Sonny stepped back and stood by the window that looked out of the office building. We need to wait for Dr. Pohl to get here so we can do this properly. I'm going to have a talk with the foreman and we can figure out how we're going to get down a hole and bring up a body. Right. Sounds good. I'm going to loiter around and see if anybody looks like they've been up to no good, Eddie replied. Sonny patted Eddie on the shoulder firmly and then motioned the two miners to join him. Together they marched upstairs to find where the foreman had disappeared to during the previous conversation. Eddie passed through the translucent doors and the wind nearly blew his hood off. There was a storm brewing up somewhere outside the relative shelter of the mall. The wind was whistling and swirling around. The miners were turning their back to the mouth of the mall out of habit. They shuffled closer together to hear each other over the whistling winds. Eddie smelled the sulfur from the geothermal vents blow away to be replaced by the smell of the spaceport kilometers downwind. A westerly wind always meant a bad storm. The spaceport stank from all the gray water they were pumping out of ships that had been in the stars for years with failing recycling systems. He was quietly surveying the miners when something caught his eye. A small figure ran out through the miners. His short stature and exposed blonde hair stood out amongst all the cowled miners. There shouldn't be any children near the mine. It had been a regulation for 20 years. Eddie started jogging towards the figure, ignoring the scowls of the miners all around him. He saw the boy glance over his shoulder, bright blue eyes flashing in the dark of the mall. Excuse me, coming through, Eddie said, apologizing to the various miners he had to jostle. The boy was now in the clear and was standing below an overhead streetlight, hiding behind its pole like it was his mother's skirts. Hey, called out Eddie as he cleared the miners. The boy's tiny milky hands were uncovered. Eddie's concern for the boy was like a tiny scream in his mind. The child wasn't properly dressed for a day in the mall. He could get frostbite or worse running around like he was. The boy's face peeked out from behind the pole, and Eddie stopped, dead in his tracks. He whispered the name of the boy in disbelief. Huey? The boy was the spitting image of his deceased son. His cold eyes stared at Eddie as he mouthed the words that he heard, not with his ears, but echoing in his mind. Open the door. Eddie stood, frozen on the spot. His hands were shaking and his heart was in his throat. The boy stood motionless as well, staring back at him with the same blue eyes as his father. Those unmistakable deep blue eyes. Eddie was about to sprint to the boy when a massive dump truck blew its bullhorn in warning. Eddie was standing in the middle of a heavy machinery lane. The truck slammed on its brakes, causing the massive archaic tires to screech in protest. Eddie vaulted out of the way as the truck flew past him, only stopping a good 20 feet past where Eddie had stood. Eddie ran around the back of the truck to look for the boy, but he was gone. He was shaking and sweating under all his layers of protective clothing. The driver yelled something filled with expletives, but he did not hear the man. He walked over to the light pole and stood staring down at where the boy had been. He looked around desperately to try and catch another glimpse of the yellow-haired child, but he had disappeared into thin air. Eddie leaned on the light pole and gripped his heart through his clothes as it was about to jump out of his chest. He clenched his eyes closed and focused on his breathing. He was having a panic attack. It was the PTSD fucking with his head. He reached into a pocket on his jacket and produced a little orange bottle of pills. He pulled off a glove with his teeth and opened the bottle with his bare hands. Pills tumbled into his naked palm. He made a fist to stop the contents from spilling all over the cave floor. Shakily, he dumped most of the pills back into the bottle, save one. Popping the pill in his mouth, he felt it instantly dissolve. A warmth flooded his face, and slowly his heart rate started dropping. For a minute, he stood gripping onto the light pole like the mast of a ship in a storm. The panic was subsiding. Slowly, he realized someone was calling his name. It was Sonny looking for him. He let go of the light pole and straightened up, wiping his eyes and face with his hands. He put back on his glove, and after one more deep breath, he turned around and headed back. The miners were still looking at him like he had lost his mind, but he ignored them. They stepped out of the way, giving him curious looks as he walked back to the office building once more. Sonny picked him out of the crowd and waved. "Forget about it. You've got work to do," Eddie whispered to himself as he forced himself into a smile. Sonny walked to him. "Where were you, old boy?" Eddie lied. "I was trying to get out of that spaceport stink." "Did it work?" Sonny asked in confusion. "No, Sonny, I should know better by now." "Don't worry, eventually you won't smell it at all like me," Sonny chuckled. "What's the deal with the dock?" Eddie asked. "That's the funny bit. Dr. Pohl went down ahead of us." "What?" Eddie asked in surprise. "That's what I said too. Dr. Pohl hates the mines. I was expecting to have to twist his arm to get him to come along." Eddie thought for a moment. Dr. Pohl had been the first responder to a mining accident in the depths of the cobalt mine. Dr. Pohl saw the same PTSD counselor as Eddie. They often crossed paths in the waiting room and spoke about their issues together. "Could have popped a pill and decided to get the whole thing over with as soon as possible," Eddie said, rubbing his stubbled chin. "Eddie, he went down there alone." "Well, no, that's impossible. No one does anything in the mine alone," Eddie said in disbelief. The foreman walked up from the office and said, "I just confirmed it. He walked right past everybody and hopped on the big elevator alone." "That's insane. He wouldn't even know how to find lithium-11 without at least one miner helping him." "Has the old boy finally cracked?" Sonny asked, turning to Eddie. "Let's go, guys. We'll track him down in no time," said Thomas, waving at a few miners. "You two go to the elevator. I'm going to get the boys to start looking. Take Mitch and Momo. I'll catch up." "Right," said Sonny, jogging back into the office building. Eddie was concerned. He knew Dr. Pohl couldn't even look at a mine without flashbacks and panic attacks. It was the same for Eddie when he was triggered by a fire alarm or the sound of emergency air scrubbers kicking in. Eddie started walking with purpose to the mine's archway entrance with its hanging yellow floodlights. Mining equipment was parked and stored up here before being brought down into the bowels of the mine on the big elevator. That was another odd thing. The big elevator was for machinery. The smaller personnel elevator was closer to the entrance and much faster. Eddie walked past that smaller elevator to the railings over an abyss. Eddie looked down the massive shaft and saw the tiny lights of the freight elevator almost a kilometer below. His asshole puckered from the dizzying drop. He wasn't particularly afraid of heights, but that was a really long way down. Sonny called out as he entered the mine with Mitch and Momo in tow. Eddie walked over to the personnel elevator. "Lids on, boys," Mitch said as he opened the metal grating to the elevator. Sonny and Eddie put their hard hats on and stepped into the rusty elevator. "Why would anyone use the big elevator if there wasn't something big going down the hole anyway?" Eddie asked his new miner friends. Momo shrugged and Mitch said, "No clue, boss, I just work here." He pressed a large button and the elevator shuddered. It began slowly crawling down the elevator shaft. It was a slow ride marked by rows of lights at every level. They passed 5 floors and kept going. 10 floors later, they were still going. "How far is lithium-11?" asked Eddie. His 3 companions looked at him and smiled. Eddie had only been transferred to homicide 7 months ago. Before that, he worked burglary, which kept him topside for the most part. This was his first time to go more than a few levels deep into a mine. Momo gave him a thumbs down symbol, and Mitch said, "All the way down and all the way back, boss. Lithium-11 is the oldest intact shaft in this here mine." They all grew silent and watched the sheer rock face slide by as the elevator descended with its rickety-sounding winches. Eddie felt something small slip into his hand. He looked down to his side, and although he saw nothing in the dim sodium lights, he felt a small hand grasp his. A chill ran up the spine. He squeezed back gently and felt the ghostly grip slip out of his. He thought about grabbing another pill from his pocket, but he had just had one. Instead, he removed his hood to better fit the hard hat onto his head. The deeper in the mine you got, the warmer it was. He unzipped his outer coat and loosened his collar. The elevator was finally reaching the bottom. Its winches squealed, and it groaned to a stop at the bottom. Momo opened the sliding metal grate, and they stepped out into the main shaft. Its ceiling was about 20 meters above their head. Everywhere around them, mining equipment and massive vehicles stood like sleeping giants. They walked over to the big freight elevator. It was empty except for a hard hat laying upside down, its lamp shining a ghostly light across the floor of the mine shaft. They all considered it in silence for a moment. Momo walked to the control panel of the elevator and pulled something out, holding the glinting metal object in his hand over his head. "That's the master key," Mitch said in disbelief. "The foreman almost never lets that out of his sight. I was wondering how your doctor used the big elevator all by himself." Momo put the key back in its keyhole and walked back, shaking his head. "We better keep going," Sonny said, without his normal cheery tone. If something was worrying Sonny, it was something truly worth worrying about. They turned their backs on the elevators and began walking past the slumbering giants to a rectangular slab of plastic steel with wheels and rubberized seats. Momo took the wheel and they all climbed aboard. Its old electric motor let out a high-pitched hum. Eddie looked behind them, and for a second he thought he saw his son again in the growing distance. He rubbed his eyes. "I haven't been getting enough sleep lately, I think," he said. Sonny knew what he meant and nodded in acknowledgement. Sonny was his partner. He knew about his son and his dreams. He never pried too deeply into Eddie's burdens, out of respect. Many cops had demons they fought only in the solitude of their dreams. Sonny never talked about his demons, but Eddie knew they were there. He hoped if Sonny ever needed it, he could lend an ear. The mine car bumped and trundled deeper into the cavernous depths. They had all switched on their headlamps by now as they turned off the main shaft into a smaller one, barely large enough for two mine cars to pass by each other. The overhead lighting was growing dimmer as they took turn after turn. If not for their miner friends, this would be an unsolvable labyrinth. But Mitch and Momo knew where they were going. Up ahead, there was another mine car. Its red taillights were like eyes in the darkness, and the headlamps illuminating one of several smaller mine shafts forking off at the end of this junction. They slowed to a stop behind the other car. "No way," Mitch said in disbelief. "That's impossible. Someone's got to be with your doctor friend. There is no way he found his own way down this deep." Eddie and Sonny exchanged worried looks as Mitch and Momo hopped out of the car. Mitch picked up something out of the other vehicle. The two partners recognized it immediately. It was Dr. Pohl's crime scene kit. "Now, why would he leave that behind?" Sonny asked Eddie. "This is getting stranger and stranger," Eddie said. They all looked down the three mine shafts in front of them, headlights flashing in the gloom. There were numbers above each tunnel. 11, 12, and 13 were the numbers from right to left. As they considered what to do next, something caught Eddie's attention. He looked reflexively down shaft 11 and caught a glimpse of a figure running off into the pitch black. "There! Did you guys see that?" Eddie shouted. "What?" they all asked. "I just saw someone down that shaft. They were running away," Eddie exclaimed. "What the bloody hell is going on now?" Sonny asked. "We have to follow," Eddie said. They all nodded and left the cars behind. Mitch and Momo took the lead. The shaft grew more narrow as it sloped downwards, deeper into the bowels of the maw. The raw rock all around them seemed to press inwards oppressively. They moved slowly but intently. Running down a mine shaft was a good way to die. Eddie hoped silently that Dr. Pohl had at least that much sense left in him. After about 10 minutes, they came up to another fork. Momo pulled a spare headlamp out of his pockets and used it as a hand lamp to investigate the two tunnels. "What now?" asked Sonny. "Now, nothing," Mitch said. "This is where we found the body." "What the hell?" Sonny exclaimed in frustration. Momo shone the light at the ground around them. "Well, he didn't get up by himself, now did he?" Sonny's words, laced with mild panic, mirrored Eddie's own fears. Momo made a few signs. "Yeah, Mo, the drill and the blood is gone all right." Eddie and Sonny eyed the miners suspiciously. "Don't look at us that way. The foreman saw everything we did. This has to be your friend messing around," Mitch said defensively. Sonny put his hands up. "Relax, guys. We're in the dark as well." Momo started down the right passage, and Mitch took a few steps down the left one. Sonny turned around to look the way that they came, taking off his hard hat for a moment to smooth his thick, graying black hair. Eddie stood in the encroaching darkness, his mind spinning. He thought of his son and looked up at the bare rock above him. He couldn't get Huey out of his head. All this was wrong. Nothing was making sense. He thought he heard a voice coming down one of the tunnels. "Open the door," it whispered. Then there was a low rumble. A slight vibration ran down the tunnel, causing dust and detritus to shake loose from the walls. Everybody froze and looked at each other with wild eyes, but before any of them could say a word, the world seemed to jump a foot to the left. They all lost their footing as the world shook. "Mindquake!" shouted Mitch. Rocks and debris rained down as the quake intensified. Eddie curled up beside the minecar with his hands over his hard hat as unimaginable force rocked everything with a deafening roar. And just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a few seconds more, the walls and ceiling continued to rain down all around them before they seemed to stop as well. Eddie looked around him and could see Sonny laying face down on the ground. It looked like Sonny had tried to run away from the two shafts in front of them and back down the way they came. But what he saw next shook him harder than the quake. The shaft that they had come down completely collapsed. The red taillights of the minecars gave this new wall that had just formed an eerie resemblance to the decompression warning lights back on Mars. Eddie leapt to his shaky feet and stumbled over to Sonny. What his headlamp illuminated was impossible. There lay Sonny, his head under a mountain of rubble blocking everything. But more importantly, sat his son in the dim lighting, looking at him with those blue eyes again. So real and alive he looked that he almost forgot about Sonny. Almost. At a loss, he stared at his son, and his son stared back at him. His neutral expression was terrifying in a way Eddie couldn't describe. He sat cross-legged and comfortably at ease beside the partially crushed torso of Sonny. His best friend in the world and his partner lay dead and silent as he shook from adrenaline. His son stared right at him in the lamplight of his hard hat. Eddie couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The air was filled with dust and smoke-like particles dancing in the tiny shaft of light. He had to do something, but his son was right there. He wanted to touch him, grab him, save him. But save him from what? He was suddenly alive and Sonny was suddenly dead. The world was upside down. Inside him, a word was forming. It was slowly working its way up from his feet to his belly and then to his mouth. It was the only word he could think of, and it was bubbling out of him. "Help," he said, hesitantly looking at his son. "Help," he said again louder, looking at the shell that once housed the bright and vibrant soul of Sundeek. "Help!" he cried out at the top of his lungs, begging for the world to stop the horrors that lay at his feet. Someone answered, not in a voice, but in a confused cry of pain. Eddie looked over his shoulder, and looking down the right mine shaft, he saw Momo sit up. His headlamp shone into Eddie's eyes, making him squint. Momo stood up, still holding his other lamp in his hand. He looked around, and then as reality came down on his head, he leapt forward with a cry. His first thoughts were obviously about Mitch, and Eddie turned his head to look at the other side of the mine shaft. His jaw dropped as Momo rounded the corner. The other shaft was gone, and a great gaping void stood where it once had been. Momo looked over the edge, and there was nothing but a bottomless pit where there had once been solid rock. Past the pit, the rest of the tunnel had caved in. There was nothing past 3 meters but a wall of rubble. Momo let out a guttural, primal roar of disbelief and grief. Mitch was gone. Eddie turned back to his own loss. His lamp once again illuminated Sonny's corpse, but Huey was gone. Eddie turned wildly as Momo's anguish filled the air with raw sorrow. There was nothing Eddie could do for Sonny or Huey. In this moment of grief, the disbelief in today's strange apparitions slid like a lodestone into his heart with a moment of madness. Had Huey come from somewhere beyond death to warn him? Had he ignored it? Was his son still alive in some form or another? He looked down at Sonny. Everything felt false, like he was still dreaming, but he couldn't deny what was right in front of his eyes. Sonny was dead, and his boy was some kind of specter. Did this mean he would see both of them again? Momo silently walked up behind Eddie. Eddie had fallen to his knees and hadn't even noticed. Momo grabbed Eddie by the coat and lifted him to his feet with astonishing strength. He spun Eddie around to face him. Momo's eyes were red and filled with tears, and his face was slack with grief. He held Eddie by the coat and turned to point to the only remaining path. A fog on Eddie's mind lifted just a little, letting his crisis dawn on him. They were trapped down a very deep mine shaft. They were trapped behind how many tons of rock? They were trapped, and they might very well die down this dark hole. They were trapped, and they needed a way out. There were people that knew where they were, but could they be reached? That quake probably wreaked havoc on all the mines. How big was that earthquake? Even a small one would be disastrous. Somewhere above in the maw's mouth, there was probably a major emergency unfolding. Momo shook him, and he snapped to attention. If anyone knew what to do next, it would be a lifer like Momo. "What do we do?" he asked. Momo pointed deep down the remaining shaft. He was right. They had to go deeper. There might be a way back up. Waiting here wouldn't do any good. Momo pushed Eddie forward. They walked forward until they were in front of the mine cars. Eddie took a few more steps, but Momo stopped at the entrance. Eddie turned around in confusion. He looked at Momo, who gestured at him to keep going. "One of us goes and one of us stays?" Eddie asked. "Don't we need to use the buddy system?" Momo shook his head sadly and motioned again for Eddie to continue on without him. "I don't understand," Eddie said. Momo dropped his hand light and turned towards the other shaft with tear-filled eyes of resignation. "No!" Eddie cried out. He leapt forward and flew out of the mine shaft just in time to see Momo step off the edge of the pitfall and disappear soundlessly into the void. "No!" he cried out again, but now Momo was gone as well. Eddie rounded the corner so fast his hard hat flew off. It tumbled down the void in front of him. Spinning end over end, it threw wild light in every direction as it skipped off the walls of the uneven pit. Further and further it dropped until it quickly was so far down he could barely see it. And then it was gone as well, leaving him in relative darkness. Eddie leaned on a wall and stared down into the pit. For a moment he thought about following Momo. It would only take one step and he could enter the gates of oblivion as well. It was then, in the darkness, he felt Huey's small hand slip into his. It squeezed tight. Eddie looked at the soot-covered face of his dead child. The boy led him by the hand into the remaining mine shaft. Slowly they walked together in a dreamlike state. He could smell something familiar, something beside the dust and rot of an old mine shaft. He could smell fire. They walked in the darkness, leaving behind the mine car's lights. Eddie was numb inside. In the darkness, he focused on the small hand in his. For a ghost, it was solid and pulled him onward. They continued in muffled silence. Eventually, Eddie began to make out a faint light. He squinted in the darkness, trying to make it out. As they grew closer, he could make out sandstone walls, metal ceilings, and plastic steel floors. They were etched in flower motifs that had petals made of bright metals like polished copper or brushed brass. These were the hallways of Mars. Eddie stopped, and in disbelief he looked out a window to his left. The Mariner Valley stretched out in front of him. How was this happening? Was he dead too? He looked to his son and saw him up ahead walking down the brightly lit corridor. "Wait," he said uncertainly. Eddie quickened his pace to keep up. He was still covered in grime and dust, but strode forward with purpose. Clinging to the ceiling was the first hint of smoke. Huey continued ahead of him. "No, not again," Eddie whispered. There was a large crash, and smoke billowed out and down the corridor. Klaxons cried out and screamed fire without words. As Eddie stumbled forward, he could hear the emergency air scrubber spin up with a maddening, shrill whine. The smoke cleared, and there he was in front of the door of his apartment block on Mars once more. This time it was different, though. Huey stood calmly in front of the door. His blue eyes met Eddie's. "Who are you?" Eddie whispered as he came to a stop. "I am the way," the boy said in Huey's voice. "I don't understand," replied Eddie. "It's time for you to let go, Eddie," the strange creature in front of him said. This was not his son. He knew it now, but he wanted it to be. He wanted it more than anything in his life. "You can see him again, but you have to let go first. You have to forget. it said, cocking Huey's head to the side with a beaming smile. Eddie's eyes were filled with tears. I don't know how, he said in despair. Yes, you do. All you have to do is open the door, said the face of Huey. Open the door? It's simple. Open the door and I can take away your pain. Open the door and I will take away your burden. The little boy turned and pointed to the apartment door. Eddie stared ahead, dazed. The little boy took hold of his hand once more and tried to lead him forwards. He stood still as a statue. There is nothing to fear, Father. All you need to do is open the door. Eddie was falling under this child's simple promises. He did want the pain to stop. He was so tired, so damn tired. The weight on his heart was so great, it felt like he was being crushed like poor Sonny. Was there a reality where he and Huey stood together in a sunny park on Earth? He took a step forward. Suddenly it was like a great hand reached out and wrapped around his body. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he floated in midair. Then he was thrown backward with such force it nearly knocked the air out of his lungs. No! Screeched the child with a terrifying, distorted voice. Flames rose up all around Eddie. He laid on the bare rock of the mine shafts in terror. All around him was fire and smoke rushing past him. A tall man stood in front of him. He was wearing miner's clothes. For a second, he thought it was Momo again, but the man was much taller. An unearthly wail came from the child's small body, its eyes no longer blue, but burning like black coals dancing with flame. The creature reached out with its hands, and the fire grew so hot it felt like Eddie would be consumed. The stranger's hard hat flew off, exposing a long, flowing mane of red hair. This was the mine shaft again, for sure. No longer on Mars. He could feel the tremors again as fires consumed all except for the stranger, standing between Eddie and the unholy creature in front of them. Behind the shell of a child, there was what looked like another mine shaft entrance. It was arched and illuminated by flame. Eddie winced in the heat, and he could tell there was a black iron door in the arch, a black iron door with a gold handle. The stranger yelled above the vortex of brimstone, "Back, demon! You shall not enter this realm while I draw breath!" The creature cried back, "This one is mine. You can't take him from me." "Close your eyes, Eddie!" the stranger cried out. Eddie looked up in disbelief. The stranger was looking down at him with a comforting smile. His long, unkempt ginger beard was beginning to smoke from the fire. "Trust me, Eddie. Close your eyes," he said in a soft tone. The stranger's eyes closed and began to glow. It was like someone was holding a flashlight against the back of his eyelids. They were glowing red through the skin, and little shafts of light were shooting out where the lids met. Eddie rolled over in desperation and covered his eyes with his gloved hands. As he did, the light from the stranger exploded in every direction. It was like staring into the sun with your eyes closed. Even through his gloves, the light was all-consuming. The creature screamed in pain. "He is mine!" the creature hissed. "Back, dream thief! You will not feast today!" cried the stranger. Eddie began to slide across the rock floor. He was being pushed away by the exchange from these two entities. He stayed curled up, desperately hoping this nightmare would stop. The creature roared, and his cries grew further and further away. The flames were being pushed back as well. The light grew impossibly brighter and brighter. Eddie cried out. He could take no more. There was a deep vibration from the sound of something imaginable, and then silence. Eddie tentatively opened his eyes. He could only see the yellow artifacts of light that had bleached his vision. He lay on the ground in the darkness. His ears were still ringing, but he could hear the soft step of someone beside him. Who had won? What kind of battle had he witnessed? He heard something plastic scrape the floor, then a light shone out in the darkness. It was the stranger's headlamp on his hard hat. With wild eyes, Eddie looked up, and the strange man smiled with a toothy grin. "It's okay, Eddie. You're safe now. Now I'll get you home," he said with a warm, friendly voice. "Home?" Eddie said. "I don't know if I even want to go home." "I know you're confused. Sleep now. Sleep and remember your son, your true son. If you die here, no one will remember him anymore." The stranger was right. What would his son say if he saw him now? Curled up like a bug on the floor of some forgotten tomb. A warm weariness came over him. He stretched out his legs and uncurled his arms. Eddie lay on his back and looked up at the large man squatting at his side. That's it, Eddie. You've earned some respite. Sleep now. Sleep and remember Huey. Eddie slipped away with a sigh. He was in his warm little home with his infant child asleep on his chest. He felt nothing but love. For this moment, his loss was gone. But more importantly, it wasn't forgotten. When he awoke, there was soft light all around him. Was he dead? He tentatively opened his eyes. Soft neon lights glowed down from the cement ceiling of the hospital room. He held up his hand and saw an IV sticking out of his skin. Past him was a window with an all-too-familiar design. He looked out and saw the landscape of the strange planet he lived on. He tried to move his other arm, but pain shot up it when he did. He groaned and looked at it. His arm was in a brace. Did he break it? His eyes focused and looked around the room. There, in the corner, sat the stranger, beaming at him. Welcome back, he said warmly. What happened to me? Eddie said with a sore, dry throat. What indeed, replied the stranger. The tall man stood up and walked in long strides to a pitcher of water beside Eddie's hospital bed. He poured a glass and grabbed a straw. The stranger held the straw up to Eddie's parched lips, and Eddie drank deeply. Eddie let out a sigh of relief and asked, Who are you? The man smiled again. My name is Benjamin. Benji to my friends. What are you? Eddie asked. Benji chuckled. I'm simply a protector. I don't understand, Eddie said. Yes, things must be rather confusing from your point of view. Look, we don't have long before people realize you're awake and then start wanting me to answer questions I'm not prepared to give. So I'll keep this short. His brown eyes spoke of sincerity, but with a hint of anxiousness. The only thing you need to understand is you're safe now. A very ancient creature called the Dream Thief was to blame for everything. Most of what you remember is false. The Dream Thief is a powerful entity that, well, steals memories. After it was done with you, you would have been a hollowed-out husk. The strangeness of the explanation almost felt normal, but Eddie was still confused. Benji spoke in hurried, hushed tones. Now, nobody knows why you went down into the mines, and they are all probably going to think you're crazy, but you're not. The Dream Thief has had its claws in you for a while now. It made you do things you don't remember. Luckily, you didn't hurt anyone, but the earthquake was real, so there's a lot of confusion going around. Eddie just shook his head. Now you're looking at me like I'm crazy, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't tell anybody about the Dream Thief if I were you. I would really hate it if you ended up in some psychiatric hospital. From everything I've seen, you're a good man, Benji said, squeezing his shoulder. I don't feel like one, Eddie said. You're stuffed full of survivor's guilt. Would it help you to know that your colleagues are alive and well? Sonny, Eddie said with a sudden ray of hope. Yes, he and Dr. Paul are fine. In fact, Benji stopped and turned his head towards the door. What is it? Eddie asked, looking at the door. Oh, nothing. I'm almost out of time, Benji said with a smile. I've been trapped on this dirt ball for a year. I think the reason why I couldn't leave was I had to neutralize the Dream Thief. I should be free to go home now. I don't understand, said Eddie, and I don't have time to explain. I need to get on the first ship out of here before something else prevents me from leaving. I am very glad to have met you, though, Eddie. Farewell. Benji smiled once more and turned around, heading towards the door. Wait, I haven't thanked you for whatever it is you did, Eddie said. Benji paused for a moment. And you'll never have to, he said as he walked through the door. Eddie lay in bed confused but grateful. He tried to remember the details of his encounter with the Dream Thief. The details were fuzzy. In the moment, he had been ready to throw everything away for a relief from his guilt, but now he couldn't understand how he had become so vulnerable as to allow it. Benji had said he had been under the influence of the Dream Thief for some time now. How long had he been sleepwalking like that? He had so many questions. Just as he thought he really would go mad, the door opened. In walked Sundeek, smiling wide. Eddie flashed back to Sundeek's body, motionless on the mine shaft floor. "Oh, thank God you're alive, Sonny," Eddie said, smiling for the first time in what seemed like forever. "Of course I'm alive, my friend. I'm not the one who was found at the bottom of a mine shaft," he said with his usual boisterous cheer. "What possessed you to go down a mine all by yourself?" "I wasn't alone. I was following two miners who said there was a body down there." "You should have called it in. I would have been there even though it was our day off," Sonny said in a worried voice. "I could have sworn that you knew, too. You and Dr. Pole. Maybe you were ahead of me. Or behind me, maybe." The details were fuzzy. His real memories were underneath the false ones. One moment he was alone on the large freight elevator, and another moment he was riding the other elevator with Sonny. If that red-haired miner hadn't found you, no one would have known where you were. "What about the two miners you followed? What were their names?" "I'm not sure of their full names. They just went by Mitch and Momo," Eddie said, massaging his forehead with his good hand. He looked back at Sonny, but Sonny had taken a step back in disbelief. "Mitch and Momo? I haven't heard those two lifers' names in more than a decade," he said, obviously shaken. "That's who they said they were," Eddie said, feeling that he was only digging himself a hole that he wouldn't be able to climb out of. "Eddie, my friend, Mitch and Momo died in a mining collapse long time ago," Sonny said, pulling up a stool to sit by the bed. "I remember because they had been a thorn in my side, but they didn't deserve an end like that. I saw their bodies myself. There is no way you met with them." "Momo, did he have a case of Vakir?" Eddie asked. "Okay, now you're really messing with me. Maybe we got drunk and I told you about them," Sonny said after some consideration. Eddie's head hurt and so did his arm. "I don't know, Sonny. My head feels like it's full of fog." Sonny shook his head. "The doctor said you have a concussion and a broken arm. My memories feel all jumbled up." "Well, you know how it is with concussions, Eddie. I once got sucker punched at a bar and forgot 2 days of my life," Sonny said. "Yeah, maybe that's it," Eddie said, wishing he believed that a concussion was all that happened to him. "I'll leave you be. You should get some rest. You should count yourself lucky. That earthquake killed a lot of people. I'm just glad you're safe." Sonny reached out and squeezed Eddie's good hand, and then he got up. "You just relax. We can talk about this another time." Eddie nodded and Sonny walked out of the room. Eddie went back to staring out the window. It was dusk over the mall. He watched the rain wash against the glass and considered all that had happened. Maybe he had gone crazy. That, ironically, would be the sanest conclusion. Fuzzy or not, he remembered everything. The smell of the mines, the heat of the fire. It didn't feel like a dream. It was more than a dream, but less than a memory. Either way, he needed to be careful what he told others. Yes, it was best that he acted like he didn't remember anything. But something had happened. He could never forget what occurred in the darkest pit of the maw, and that was for the best. Real or not, he would no longer try to forget his pain. Instead, he needed to move on. Not like the dream thief had wanted him to, but in a way his son would be proud of him for. In the end, isn't that all anyone can do? Losing someone was like losing a part of yourself. It was time for Eddie to learn how to live without it. The rain droned on above the small colony like it had for millennia, oblivious and indifferent to the plight of man. On and on the rain would fall until the maw itself was eventually washed away. It would continue until any sign of man was completely and utterly forgotten, just like the dream thief.
And there we go. My sister has a channel. I'll link in the description below in case you're curious. If you want more of this type of content, let me know. There's also a playlist with all my other story times that you can click on. It'll all be in the description. Check out the description if you want to know more. Bye.